Our story begins with our protagonist asking Katarina if she knows that Tillman Castle, which can be seen in front of them, has not fallen to any enemies even once over the span of 200 years. Katarina, however, just asks Simon what he is suddenly talking about and panically tells him that they should get out of there because they are not supposed to be in that place. He assures her that it is all right because no one will come there at that time, yet she reminds him that she needs to finish up her cleaning duties. Still, he tells her that it will really just take a short while. He adds that he really wants to show her the scenery from that place, and it looks especially amazing at that time of day. She sighs and asks him what is so amazing about the land of the nobles, where they couldn't even live. He tells her that he might be able to buy a house there because he thinks he will get promoted to an intermediate mage this time. He explains that he wrote a thesis on a new golem, which his seniors really liked, and they said if the elder acknowledges it as well, then he will likely be promoted. He adds that it won't be a big house, but he should be able to buy one where the two of them could live. He then asks her if she would marry him, which surprises her. He holds her hand while telling her that she has suffered a lot for his sake all this time, so starting now, he would make her the happiest person in the world. She is speechless upon hearing this for a moment, and tells him that before he says such a thing, he should become an intermediate mage first. She then touches his lips, which makes him shy, and he stutteringly tells her that she is so mean. She laughs hard at his reaction and tells him that she was just kidding and wasn't expecting such a day to come for them too. Simon thinks they could be happy, because he has worked really hard for their happiness. The scene then shifts to when he hears someone praising the elder for creating a new magic technique that uses golems. The person tells the elder that the thesis he wrote would change the world. The elder laughingly replies to the Duke that it is too flattering, and that it is all thanks to the Duke's unreserved investment in him, which Simon overhears and realizes he was wrong. Even if he works hard for the rest of his life, nothing will change. The Duke then asks the elder about the request he made, and the elder replies that he hasn't forgotten. The Duke then asks the elder if it is really all right for him, to which the elder responds that she is just a woman of lowly birth. Suddenly, Simon sees the knights holding a lady and is shocked to see Katarina, shaking and injured. The knights forcefully drag Katarina toward the Duke and the elder, making Simon think that even if she is of lowly birth, it doesn't mean they can take anything they want and trample all over them. The Duke tells the elder that he has heard Katarina is pretty famous for her looks, and she is just as he expected. The elder agrees and adds that if Katarina were not of lowly birth, she would have lived a vastly different life. Simon knows these are all things he has dreamed of his entire life, but everything he has desperately protected is destroyed. Simon then gathers power in his hand in anger and aims it at them, shouting and asking how they can destroy everything like it is nothing. He calls them fuckers and tells them to take their hands off Katarina. The elder calls him a brat and gathers a strong amount of power in his hand, asking if Simon does not know his place, and reminding him that he is just trash. The elder then throws his power at Simon, destroying Simon's glasses and hitting him in the body, throwing him away. Katarina is shocked to see him being flung, and before Simon passes out, he hears Katarina worriedly calling his name. Weeks later, Simon is in a cell staring at a rat. The other rats walk closer to him as he just looks at them, thinking that there is nothing he can do. He grabs one of the rats and looks at the scratches he has made on the wall to count the days, wondering how he has survived. Suddenly, a spear was stabbed behind Simon, and the knights teasingly asked if he was really trying to eat the mouse. They added that even a mage of the magic tower was worth nothing in his current state. The first knight mockingly told him to just tell them everything already, saying that if he helped them summon the golem, they would release him immediately. When he didn't answer, the first knight angrily asked if he was even listening, while the second knight laughed and reminded the first that he had said Simon went completely crazy after that woman died. The first knight asked why Katarina had died, and the second knight replied that she had committed suicide, saying she wanted to protect her fidelity. The second knight added that it was a waste of life as they walked away from Simon's cell. Simon overheard the knights teasingly saying that Katarina was too pretty to have died like that, and that it was a pity. This made Simon furious. He bit his finger until it bled and whispered an apology to Katarina. The knights then noticed the rats roaming around as if they were searching for something. The first knight asked why the rats were acting like that today, remarking that it was as if they were waiting for something. The second knight noticed that something seemed wrong and ordered the first knight to spear one of the rats. The first knight complied, but when the rat was stabbed, it released a magic circle, and the circle absorbed the rat's blood, shocking the knights. Meanwhile, Simon was creating a magic circle using his own blood. He thought to himself that he was too weak. The knights noticed his actions and shouted for him to stop immediately. Ignoring them, he continued casting and mockingly asked if they wanted him to stop. He told them that he was just getting started, then slammed his hand into the magic circle. The rats began to scream in pain, and magic circles appeared in their stomachs. Simon thought bitterly that if he had been just a little stronger, he wouldn't have lost Katarina. Fueled by his anger, he successfully activated the magic circle. The cell Simon was in then exploded, and when the smoke cleared, the knights saw Simon standing there with something huge behind him. The knights confirmed that it was a rat golem, but Simon coldly told them that the expressions on their faces were the same as Katarina's. Simon reflected on how he had tried to find reasons for his survival. The rat golem then slashed the two knights in half with a single swing. Simon and the golem barged out of the prison, and he thought to himself that he was still alive because he needed to take revenge on the cursed world where he and Katarina couldn't live a happy life together. He ordered his golem rats to attack everyone inside the prison, telling Katarina not to worry. He promised her that he wouldn't be weak like before and would obtain any power necessary to change everything. Eventually, Simon arrived at the elder's room. The elder stared at him and his massive rat golem, calling Simon a bastard and asking if he was out of his mind. The elder demanded to know how Simon, someone who served God, could use black magic and work with demons. Simon simply asked, "What about it?" The Duke begged Simon to spare him, offering to make him the master of the land. The Duke pleaded, saying that if Simon spared his life, he would do anything he wanted. Simon aimed his hand at the Duke and incinerated him into ashes, coldly stating that he couldn't bring back the dead. Simon then destroyed the entire magic tower, swearing to Katarina that he would destroy the cursed world. Days later, in another kingdom, the king bestowed a sword upon the hero Lacan and implored him to save the world. The king explained that the world had fallen into the shadows of darkness, with the army of the Demon King, corrupted by evil, trampling God's territory and slaughtering innocent people. The king added that the evil army had already destroyed 2 kingdoms and 1 dukedom, leaving the fate of the world solely in Lacan's hands. The king begged Lacan to kill the Demon King and save the world. Lacan accepted the sword, taking on the responsibility of saving the world. He raised the sword proudly and called upon the brave warriors of the divine Artenia Empire. He proclaimed that the brilliant light of their empire had dimmed, and a humongous shadow was swallowing the Lodasia continent. However, he declared that they would not stand down for their families and for the world. Lacan rallied his warriors, shouting that they would kill the Demon King that day and become the last hope to protect their world. Years earlier, in the Magic Tower, at the library, Katarina asked Simon if he had heard the news. She questioned how it made sense to cut off a child's hands just for stealing some bread. He stammered and told her she was speaking too loudly, asking what would happen if someone heard her. But she just shouted that nobles could only impose such harsh punishments so easily because they never had to worry about going hungry. She asked why the child had to be punished so unfairly, and if it was just because of the social class he was born into. She then sadly told Simon that children don't choose the circumstances they are born into, making him smile. He told her that perhaps a day would come when social status no longer mattered and everyone could live equally and freely. However, she called him out seriously, shouting that a day like that wouldn't come just by waiting for it. He asked her what she wanted to do, and she replied that they had to be the change they wanted to see in the world. Otherwise, the children they raised in the future would go through the same suffering. Simon dropped the books he was holding in shock and shyly shouted that they weren't even married yet. She calmly told him that wasn't the important part of the message, and asked if he wasn't planning to marry her. Her question made him blush and left him speechless. He stammered that he would marry her but wasn't ready yet. As he picked up the books, she teasingly asked if he would marry her or not, to which he stammered that he would. She then bent down to look at him and told him he was terrible, adding that he was so shy she was probably the only person who would ever marry him. In the present, the Magic Tower had become a demon realm, and Simon, once happily in love, was now consumed by darkness. He whispered to Katarina that soon everything would be over. It had taken a long time, but he vowed to make the world they had once dreamed of a reality. Lacan and his warriors arrived at the demon realm. The soldiers approached Simon but stopped at Lacan's command. Lacan called Simon the Demon King and accused him of filling the entire world with suffering. He declared that it would all end that day and swore in the name of God and justice that all of Simon's evil deeds would be judged. Simon, however, laughed mockingly at Lacan's words and asked if Lacan really thought he would fear some false god and their hypocritical sense of justice. Lacan shouted back that Simon should fear it and raised his sword, proclaiming that countless heroes of the empire stood with him to bring judgment upon Simon. Rallying his warriors, Lacan declared that they would take down the Demon King and protect their world. With a battle cry, Lacan launched himself at Simon, and the warriors followed him. As the warriors charged and launched their spears, Simon asked them who they were to judge him. He angrily declared that it was he who should be the judge. Simon stabbed his wand into the ground, releasing a powerful shockwave as he shouted that the day Katarina died, justice also died. The force of his power caused everyone to halt in their tracks. Simon declared that he no longer believed in illusions like justice and would show them the only thing he now believed in: power. Simon unleashed a massive golem, its deafening scream so powerful it pushed Lacan and his warriors back. Simon told Lacan to behold the birth of true justice. He denounced their deceptive faith and proclaimed that the day marked the beginning of a new era. Behind him, an army of golems emerged. One of the golems charged forward, raising its massive fist to attack. The warriors panicked at the sight of so many golems but tried to steel their resolve, knowing there was no future if they retreated. Simon called the warriors fools, telling them they were nothing but garbage clinging to their social status. He asked how they dared to resist true power and declared that it was over, he would eradicate them all. Lacan positioned himself and called out to Simon before dashing forward. He vowed that Simon's actions were unforgivable and that he would put an end to his evil deeds. Lacan easily slashed through a golem's hand, shouting that Simon's reign of terror would end there. Simon was stunned that Lacan had taken down an elite golem with just one strike. He realized that the reason he couldn't conquer the Livia kingdom, no matter how many golems he sent, was because of Lacan. Simon glares at Lacan, and Lacan does the same. Both shouted at each other that they would die there, charging into battle. Hours later, many warriors lay dead, and only one golem remained. Lacan his breath, glancing at Simon, while telling him that it was time to put an end to everything and face the last remaining golem. Moments later, the golem shattered into pieces, leaving only Simon standing. Simon called out to Lacan, who was visibly exhausted. When Lacan prepared to behead him, Simon stopped him, saying that Lacan didn't understand. Lacan paused in his tracks. Simon told him that the world was rotten, and if not for him, Simon could have destroyed everything and started anew. Lacan was shocked when he saw tears running down Simon's face. Then, Simon cursed Lacan, vowing that his entire bloodline would live their lives in suffering. Lacan gripped his sword tightly and beheaded Simon in one swift strike. As Simon's life faded, memories of Katarina filled his mind. He remembered her asking if he knew that, when he smiled and was with her, healthy and without problems, she was the happiest. In the memory, she reached for his face, kissed him on the lips, and told him she loved him. Suddenly, Simon woke up. Gasping, he clutched his neck, bewildered. He wondered if it had all been a dream, as his head was still intact. Feeling a slight dizziness, he examined his hands, noticing there were no wounds. He questioned how this was possible. Looking around the unfamiliar room, he realized it was unlike any place he had seen before. He wondered if he was in a foreign country, and how he was still alive, knowing that even black magic couldn't bring someone back to life. If it were possible, he thought, he would have already done it. Confused, his gaze settled on a portrait in the room. His heart raced as he recognized it. It was a portrait of Lacan. Suddenly, the door to the room opened, and a butler stepped in. The butler addressed him as young lord and froze in shock upon seeing Simon awake. Rushing forward, the butler embraced him and exclaimed in relief, saying that after 2 weeks without waking, they had feared they had lost the last Lacan. Simon stared at the butler, confused, and asked what he meant by young lord and who he was. The butler's face turned pale, and he anxiously asked Simon if he didn't recognize him. Kneeling in despair, the butler shouted that the accident must have damaged Simon's memories. He blamed himself, tearfully declaring that it was his failure to provide proper care. The butler stood up, trying to calm himself. He told Simon that his memory loss might only be temporary, and that perhaps things would come back to him as he explained. With trembling sincerity, the butler revealed the truth. He explained that Simon was soon to become the lord of that place, the successor to the Lacan Viscountcy of the Baroque Empire, and a descendant of the great hero Lacan Luc de Lacan. Simon was stunned into silence. He sat down on the bed in shock, unable to believe that Lacan had died 500 years ago, and that he himself had been reincarnated as Lacan's descendant 500 years into the future. For a moment, he was speechless, then abruptly ran away, shocking the butler. The butler shouted that he shouldn't be moving around so much in his condition, but he didn't listen. He rushed to the balcony door, his mind racing with disbelief, wondering if they truly expected him to believe such a story, and if they took him for a fool. None of it made sense. He grabbed the door handle and flung it open, shouting in frustration that it simply didn't make sense. But he froze in shock when he saw a massive suit of armor standing before him. Staring at it, he wondered what it was. Deep down, he realized that if it existed, it confirmed that everything the butler had said was true. He studied the machine, noting that it was far more advanced than the golem magic he knew. A weapon of such sophistication one he had only imagined stood right in front of him. The butler called out to him in concern, but he ignored him and instead asked for his name. The butler introduced himself as Hans, his personal servant. Simon then asked Hans what the machine was, and Hans explained that it was called a gigant, a bipedal humanoid weapon. Simon asked if it was created using golem magic, and Hans replied that he was partly correct. A gigant, Hans explained, was made through a combination of scientific hextech and magic. Due to technological advancements, unlike golems, which were controlled remotely, gigants were piloted directly by individuals inside them. Simon asked Hans to confirm that people actually went inside the machines, and Hans simply nodded. Simon realized how much advanced technology must have gone into creating such weapons. If Hans was telling the truth, gigants were incredible, capable of ensuring safety from external threats and reacting far more quickly than remotely controlled golems. He also noted that gigants addressed all the problems he had faced with golems in his time. Walking around the room, Simon appeared lost in thought, confusing hands. Eventually, he returned indoors and stopped abruptly. If such technology existed, it could only mean one thing: 500 years had indeed passed. He stared at his hands, bitterly wondering why he had been reborn as a descendant of his sworn enemy. A moment later, Hans shouted his name in alarm. Simon was drinking alcohol. Hans rushed toward him, worriedly urging him to calm down and take care of himself. Simon looked at Hans with a cold expression and asked if it was true that he was a descendant of Lacan. Hans confirmed it. Simon then asked why, if he was supposedly a descendant of the great hero, he felt such pain. Doubling over in agony, he clutched the table and cursed, demanding to know what was happening. Hans, deeply worried, admitted that he had tried to warn Simon and explained that it was the curse. Simon froze and asked Hans what he meant by a curse. Hans sighed, realizing that Simon truly had no memory of it. Hans began to recount the story of Lacan's battle against the Demon Lord, but Simon impatiently told him to skip to the point. Hans explained that, although Lacan had been praised for saving the world, he had died young due to the Demon Lord's curse. Simon's mind reeled. Could it really be true? He suddenly remembered the moment he had cursed Lacan, saying that his entire bloodline should suffer for eternity. He slapped his forehead in frustration, realizing it was something he had said in anger because he was furious at the time. 500 years ago, the world had faced a catastrophic threat: the Demon Lord. The Demon Lord's dark magic could summon golems far stronger than any army. Countless soldiers were wiped out with a flick of his hand. The world had seemed doomed, but thanks to the righteous warrior Lacan, peace was restored. However, before the Demon Lord was defeated, he cast a curse upon Lacan and his descendants, ensuring they would all die painful deaths at a young age. Simon closed the book he was reading, anger boiling inside him. He muttered that they had spun the story however they wanted. He knew he hadn't even cast a proper curse in the first place. Did people really believe a curse could last for 500 years? He sighed, deciding not to dwell on it. It was his fault for losing. Simon let out a bitter sigh, wondering why he had been reborn as his enemy's descendant. It felt as though he was the one truly cursed. He pulled another book from the shelf and sat down, thinking deeply. He realized this was his second chance, a chance to accomplish what he couldn't in his previous life. He couldn't face Katerina if he didn't take this opportunity. He thought about the world, which had remained rotten for another 500 years. If anything, it was likely more corrupt now. However, Simon felt certain that not all of his followers could have been wiped out. He resolved to learn as much as he could about this era. If he could reunite with his followers, he swore he would change the world this time. The next day, he was still in the library. Frustrated, he threw a book on the ground and took a swig of alcohol. He cursed his followers, enraged by the realization that people had almost completely forgotten about the Demon Lord. He stood up, muttering that it was too much, even if 500 years had passed, and lamented there wasn't even a trace of his existence left. Feeling dizzy, he acknowledged that his current body lacked both mana and stamina, leaving him to wonder what he could even do in this state. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his ankle, causing him to trip and slam his head on the floor. Sighing in frustration, he asked himself what he should do now. As he clenched his fists, his thoughts turned to Katerina. Sadly, he asked if he had been doomed to achieve nothing in life, and he lamented that all he had wanted was to create a world where everyone was equal and content. Suddenly, he heard someone loudly calling his name from outside. Confused, he peeked through the window, wondering what the commotion was about. A man was shouting, demanding to know how much longer he intended to avoid them. The man declared that they, the merchants, wouldn't take a single step back until they had an audience with the young master. The man introduced himself as Darren, the branch master of the Alum Merchant Association. Simon chuckled bitterly, realizing Lacan's descendant must have it rough, and wondered if he was in debt. Darren shouted that the young master owed them 30,000 pesos, borrowed the previous year to develop a mine. He accused the young master of avoiding repayment ever since and demanded to know if they even intended to pay it back, adding that he couldn't live like this anymore. Hans appeared and tried to defuse the situation, telling Darren that the young master was unwell and needed rest, but promising they would find a way to pay him back. Hans asked Darren to come back another time. Darren, however, firmly refused and insisted that he needed to hear directly from the young master on the matter. His words silenced everyone. Darren then suggested that, based on their reaction, they didn't have the means to pay back the debt right now. He offered them an alternative hand over the gigant in their possession. He noted that the gigant, being secondhand, probably wasn't worth the full 30,000 pesos and claimed he was giving them a generous offer. The knight commander, Roger, shouted that such a thing was impossible. Roger angrily added that they only had 3 gigants in the entire household and demanded to know how they were supposed to defend their territory without them. He declared that he would rather die than allow them to take the gigants, as they were crucial to their defense. Hans tried to calm Roger, assuring him that it wouldn't happen. The accountant, Dixon, then suggested raising taxes temporarily instead of taking the deal. Hans, furious, asked Dixon if he had any idea how the people were faring. Hans shouted that they couldn't burden the few people they had left with higher taxes. Dixon, stammering, responded that the only viable option was to hand over the gigant. This made Roger livid, and he shouted again that it was out of the question. Simon listened to the servants argue about what to do, laughing to himself. He found it ironic and amusing, thinking that it was a great household, and that Lacan should have seen it. Darren interrupted the argument, asking everyone to relax. He admitted that, Personally, he wanted to seize the gigant and the manor. However, he said he didn't want people to think of them as the kind of merchants who would take from the house of the great hero. Then, with a calm demeanor, Darren pointed in the direction of the gigant. Roger, seething with anger, asked if Darren was joking and demanded to know how many times he had to say that they couldn't give up the gigant. But Darren smiled and clarified that he wasn't pointing at the gigant. Instead, he was pointing at the magic tower behind it. Everyone froze in shock. Roger, breaking the silence, admitted that the magic tower might be a better choice than the gigant, to which Hans reluctantly agreed, noting that no one ever used the tower anymore. Dixon chimed in, saying that the tower had once generated some income as a tourist attraction but had since become useless. He added that some people even believed the tower was the source of the curse. Simon's expression darkened as he listened. He cursed Lacan under his breath, furious at the revelation. That magic tower was his, and he couldn't believe that Lacan had built his manor right on the spot where he had defeated him. 500 years ago, where the Demon King's tower now stood, Simon's home had been far away from that place. It was an old and worn-down house, but it was there as a cozy resting place where he and Katarina had dreamed of a better future together. So, when Simon heard Darren mention that the land around the Demon Tower had crossed into the territory of their company, he was furious. How dare they go after that place? Darren laughed, telling his servant not to worry too much. With their company's diverse capabilities, he said, they would be able to turn it into a popular tourist spot while greatly enhancing the local economy. Hans and Roger remained silent, deep in thought, while Dixon eagerly asked Darren where he should sign. However, their conversation was interrupted by an overwhelming presence. They turned to see Simon storming out of the estate, his anger palpable. Hans rushed toward him, asking if it was all right for him to be walking in his condition, but Simon curtly ordered them to step aside. Darren greeted him with a sly grin, saying it had been hard to secure a meeting with him. He asked if Simon had already recovered and explained that the talks with his vassals were going well. All that remained was Simon's signature to finalize their company's management of the Demon Tower. But Simon cut him off, coldly asking if all Darren knew how to do was talk. Darren, confused, asked what he meant, but Simon pressed further, demanding to know if Darren even understood what kind of place the Demon Tower was and how he dared to try to take control of it. Darren and his knights began to tremble, unsettled by Simon's fierce demeanor. This was not the man they had heard about. Darren hesitated but then tried to save face, telling Simon that their company had been considerate of his situation. However, if Simon continued speaking in such a manner, they would withdraw their proposal. Simon scoffed and called Darren a conman, telling him to zip it. He stated plainly that he knew their true intentions after taking the land that stood at the center of their territory, near the main estate. They would use the guise of development and tourism to expand their influence and authority. He then demanded to know if he had gotten anything wrong. Darren, shocked, stammered that Simon's accusations were far-fetched, but Simon dismissed him, accusing their company of being so pathetic that they couldn't even sell second-hand weapons. He added that their latest attempt to take over the territory was a step too far. Simon declared that while he despised incompetence, what he hated even more were people who were utterly evil on the inside. Panicking, Darren realized he couldn't let Simon gain the upper hand. Summoning his resolve, Darren shouted back that the Lacan household was unable to repay its debt, which was why they had come up with such a considerate proposition. He argued that the company needed to recover its money somehow. Simon's eyes narrowed. He angrily asked who said they weren't repaying their debt, and then declared that in 10 days they would repay everything, including the interest. He ordered Darren and his men to leave immediately. Releasing a powerful aura, he left them stunned and paralyzed with fear. Darren hiccuped in panic, hastily retreating with his knights. As they drove off, Darren shouted that they would see if Simon could truly stand by his words. Fuming, Simon muttered to himself that men like Darren all acted the same. Behind him, Roger called out, shouting in disbelief at what Simon had just said to Darren. Simon turned in confusion, asking what Roger meant. To his surprise, all of his vassals placed their hands on their chests as a sign of their pledge and shouted that they were deeply touched by his words. Hans, brimming with excitement, praised Simon for his insight, saying he had seen through all of Darren's plans. Roger added that Simon's anger to protect their ancestors' accomplishments and honor was inspiring. Simon blinked, baffled, and asked what on earth they were talking about. Roger simply smiled and told Simon that he hadn't realized how much pride he took in the household's honor. He remarked on how Darren, the merchant bastard, had been completely cowed by Simon's fierce response. Roger concluded that, in that moment, he saw the image of their ancestor, the great hero Lacan, in Simon. He was furious, thinking that those incompetent fools were trying to turn him into the Demon King again. But he took a deep breath, calming himself when Hans approached and asked how he intended to repay the debt. He countered by asking Hans how much 30,000 pesos was worth. Hans replied that it could buy 10,000 sacks of wheat, or a single unit of the new warrior-class gigant. Hans added that they didn't have enough collateral to borrow money from a bank or other merchants and asked if he had any other solutions. Simon dismissed Hans's suggestions as unhelpful and told him to step aside, declaring that he would repay the debt in his own way. He instructed Hans to stay put and watch as he made his way back to the mansion. A short while later, he began inspecting the household's assets, facilities, and food supplies, only to find them completely depleted. Frustrated, he threw the paperwork to the floor and angrily asked Hans if this wasn't the household that had killed the Demon King. Why was there nothing left? Had someone stolen it all? Hans, visibly shaken, assured him that nothing had been stolen and begged him not to say such things. Hans explained that he would understand if he looked at the genealogy. Simon dismissed the idea, asking if Hans seriously thought he would look at something like that. Hans continued, explaining that after hero Lacan killed the Demon King, he was bestowed the title of Marquis, along with a large southern territory in the Livia Kingdom. Simon responded, so what? Hans went on to explain that Duke Baroque later incited a rebellion against the kingdom, and Lacan, unable to stand the injustice, fought against him. However, under the Demon King's curse, Lacan suffered a crushing defeat. After the rebellion, Lacan's title was revoked, and he was exiled to the borders of the kingdom, where he eventually passed away due to the rapid deterioration of his health. Simon realized that Lacan hadn't chosen to establish his estate there intentionally. Simon remarked that the household's financial situation was so dire that it was a wonder how it had managed to survive for 500 years. He asked Hans how things had ended up this way. Hans sighed deeply, replying that it was due to their ancestors, who had clung to the hope of regaining the household's former glory. Simon asked what Hans meant by that. Hans explained that, for the sake of making a comeback, his ancestors had been willing to do anything, even if it meant using up all their assets, authority, and resources. Hans continued, saying that his ancestors had desperately wanted to recover the reputation of the household. However, due to the generational curse passed down through the family, no matter how hard they worked, their efforts had always been in vain. This, he said, was how the household, once home to the hero who saved the world, had fallen into ruin. Hans then hesitated but added that he wasn't sure if Simon remembered. He explained that the reason Simon had been unconscious for more than half a month was due to the Gigant incident. Simon had worked tirelessly to restore the household's reputation, trying to prove that he had the qualities of a hero. But he had pushed himself too hard, ultimately collapsing from exhaustion. Simon was speechless upon hearing this. Slowly, he rose from his chair and walked to the window. Staring outside, he quietly told Hans that, given their current situation, there didn't seem to be anything they could do. Hans, filled with regret, replied sadly that even as the butler of the household, there was nothing he could do to help. He apologized sincerely. As Simon continued looking outside, Hans tried to comfort him, saying that he was sure there must be something they could do. Hans added that, even if it cost him his life, he would find a way to raise the total amount needed to save the household. Simon turned to Hans with a faint smile and reassured him that it wouldn't be necessary, he had just thought of something. Hans looked at him, confused. Simon then asked Hans seriously if it was true that they just needed to pay the money back somehow. Hans felt a sinking sensation, suspecting that something was about to go terribly wrong. The next day, Hans, along with the other household members, stood frozen in disbelief. Roger, with tears streaming down his face, demanded to know how it could have happened. Hans's thoughts raced. When the young master had said they would repay the money somehow, he hadn't imagined he meant selling the statue of hero Lacan. No one could believe it. The statue, the very pillar of their household, was gone. Cries of despair filled the air as everyone shouted that this must be a bad dream. Hans knew that Lacan's statue had still been there until yesterday and wondered where it could have gone. He looked around but quickly dismissed the thought, realizing that finding Simon was more important. One of the knights approached Hans in a panic, shouting that there was a problem. Hans, stuttering, asked what it was but then immediately changed the subject, shouting that it didn't matter right now and demanding to know Simon's whereabouts. The knight, equally flustered, replied that he thought Simon had left when security was at its weakest. Hearing this, Hans fell to his knees in frustration, shouting at their young lord, asking what he was scheming. Meanwhile, in a forest, Simon was in a carriage with Lacan's statue. The driver, glancing back, asked if he could pose a question without being rude. Simon agreed, asking the man who he was again. The driver laughed awkwardly, asking if Simon had already forgotten. He then introduced himself as Philip, explaining that he served as Simon's guard knight. Philip hesitated but eventually asked if Simon truly intended to sell the statue. Simon replied affirmatively, adding that the statue should fetch quite a bit if melted down. Philip, horrified, reminded him that the statue carried 500 years of history. Simon raised his foot threateningly, causing Philip to recoil in fear. He then asked Philip if those 5 centuries of history had ever fed him. Philip protested, saying that selling the statue wouldn't be enough to repay their debts. Simon assured Philip that the statue was only a small part of his plan. Relieved that there was a plan, Philip said he was sure everyone would understand, as long as the debts were repaid. Philip then asked about the plan, and Simon seriously replied that he intended to use the money from selling the statue to gamble and win the 30,000 pesos. Philip was shocked and abruptly stopped the carriage. Shouting, Philip asked what would happen if Simon lost all the money instead. Seaman dismissively asked why Philip had come with him if he was only going to lecture him. Philip reminded him that it was Seaman who had dragged him out at dawn, and if he had known about this plan, he wouldn't have come. Philip nervously suggested turning back now and begging for forgiveness, saying they could come up with a new plan. Seaman scoffed, calling Philip an idiot, and pointed out that if they returned, he would have to explain why he had taken their great predecessor statue. He added that if he confessed it was because he needed money for gambling, the household would never forgive him. He was certain he'd be permanently expelled if he went back now. Philip was stunned, but Seaman continued, speculating that they might not be able to expel him since he was still Seaman. Instead, he guessed Philip would be the one punished and cast out, which made Philip shake in fear. He laughingly told Philip to choose wisely, asking him to think about what was better for him. He asked Philip if he wanted to become a penniless vagrant or a hero who would bring honor to the household. He ordered Philip to decide. Philip, stuttering, replied that they would keep going as planned. Seaman laughed, praised Philip, and told him they should just go for it. Philip cursed under his breath, remembering that he'd heard rumors about Seaman's personality changing after waking up from his coma. But now, he thought Seaman was practically the devil himself. Later, they arrived at the dock, where the captain shouted that they only had 5 minutes until departure. Philip hesitated, asking if they were really getting on. Seaman retorted by asking if they should just turn back instead. Stammering, Philip replied that they should board the boat. Once they were both on, the captain rang the bell, signaling the boat's departure, and it began its journey to another city. That night, they arrived at the harbor city of Lamer. There, they sold the historical statue of Hero Lacan. Philip handled the money from the sale but asked the buyer if that was really all he was paying for such an important statue. He emphasized that it was the statue of the hero who saved the world. The buyer replied that he would go out of business if he paid more. Simon called Philip, ordering him to guide the way. As they walked away, Philip muttered that they could have gotten more for the statue, but Simon dismissed his complaint, saying it was good enough. He then commented that Lamer had certainly changed, prompting Philip to ask if he had been there before. Seaman replied that he had, though only briefly, and it wasn't like this back then. He explained that years ago it was nearly impossible to reach Lamer because of a kraken, making it little more than a deserted island. Reflecting, he realized it really had been 500 years and remarked that coming to Lamer was a good idea. Philip, now excited, thanked him and added that he didn't know how long it had been since Seaman last visited. But Lamer was now very different. He explained that the city was now the second largest in the southern region of the empire, constantly changing due to its growth. He reiterated that it used to be an island no one could reach easily because of the kraken and other sea monsters. However, with advancements in magical engineering and weaponry, the area had become far more populated. Philip then mentioned that, naturally, the gambling scene in Lamer was enormous and nervously asked if Simon was confident about gambling. Seaman replied that if he wasn't confident, he wouldn't have come. Moments later, they arrived at a massive gambling hall. Seaman told Philip they should head inside, but Philip shouted for him to wait, saying he needed to take a few deep breaths first. Seaman asked what Philip was so afraid of. Philip, still nervous, asked how Simon could stay so calm and if he even knew how to win at the games. Seaman confidently replied that he had an idea and assured Philip that when it came to gambling, attitude was everything. Minutes later, Seaman was seated at a card table. His opponent smirked and remarked that things weren't looking good for him, laughing as he announced yet another win. The opponent asked if Seaman wanted to continue, leaving him sweating profusely and speechless with worry. His opponent laughed and remarked that luck was smiling on him today. Seaman replied that it was fine since ability was also a part of luck, which made his opponent laugh harder. The opponent told him he was certainly generous and added that it was an honor to play a game with such a cool Simon. However, noticing he had no coins left, the opponent suggested ending the game. Seaman confidently replied that they could keep going and ordered Philip to exchange all their remaining money for more coins. Philip protested, shouting that they couldn't risk it because if they lost, it would be over. Seaman snapped at Philip not to talk back and to bring the coins. The opponent observed this exchange, thinking that Seaman was agitated and that his own luck was unbeatable today. Simon placed all his coins on the table and declared that he would wager his entire fortune, going all in. Philip, watching nervously, thought the family was doomed. The opponent asked if he was serious, admitting that the stakes made him nervous since this was his first time playing such a big game. Still, he said he'd be fine with it. Seaman calmly replied that being anxious wouldn't change the results. The opponent signaled to the lady behind him and praised Seaman for his impressive composure before asking if they should reveal their cards. He confidently revealed his triple eights and shouted excitedly that the goddess of luck was on his side. As he reached to collect the coins, Seaman stopped him, reminding him that they hadn't checked his cards yet. Seaman then laid down an ace, king, and queen, revealing a royal flush. He told the opponent that, surprisingly enough, he had these cards. The opponent was stunned and shouted that it made no sense. Seaman smirked and said, "Aren't those sudden reversals the joy of gambling?" He reached out to shake the opponent's hand, calling it an enjoyable match. Philip cried in relief, shouting that he always believed in Simon. Suddenly, The opponent slammed his fist on the table in anger. He accused Simon of cheating, claiming there was no way he got those cards without tricks. Simon calmly asked if he meant having people behind him to relay his cards. The opponent froze in shock, wondering how Simon knew. Simon continued, pointing out that all the nearby spectators were the opponent's subordinates secretly passing cards. He explained that he'd noticed their scheme early on and had marked the cards with mana. Manipulating them was simple for him, given his experience controlling a golem army. He concluded by saying that for someone like him, switching cards was a trivial task, making it easy to win without resorting to fancy tricks. Simon ordered the opponent to acknowledge his loss. However, the opponent declared that the business was over and signaled his men to teach Simon some etiquette. The opponent's men drew their weapons, and Simon sighed in frustration, muttering about how people hadn't changed in 500 years. Gathering his magic power in his hand, he challenged them to attack. As the men rushed him, Philip shouted for Simon to duck and swiftly slash the attackers. Philip then asked how they dared draw their swords against the sole heir of the Lacan family, warning them that it meant they were prepared to risk their lives. The opponent, now terrified, admitted his guilt and begged for mercy. Philip, enraged, shouted at him to shut up and demanded to know how he dared harm Simon. Simon watched in amazement as Philip effortlessly defeated the attackers and thought to himself that Philip wasn't bad after all. Later, Philip carried a huge bag of money and remarked on how heavy it was, estimating that it was definitely more than 10,000 pesos. Simon agreed, glancing back at Philip and thinking that although he'd once seen Philip as just a porter, he was far more talented than expected. Reflecting, he thought the day's earnings weren't bad but acknowledged that causing chaos at the gambling house would make it harder to visit others. He asked Philip if there were other ways to make money besides gambling houses. Philip thought for a moment and suggested the Gigant Arena. Curious, Simon asked what it was. Philip explained that, much like the human combat arenas of the past, Gigant Arenas featured matches between giants. Depending on the match, the dividend rate could vary, but it was possible to earn 30,000 pesos or more. Intrigued, Simon considered the Gigants, suspecting they were developed with golem magic. He thought this might help him predict the outcomes of matches. Philip confidently told him to trust him, explaining that he had been a top student at the Imperial Military Gigant Academy. Simon nodded and told Philip to lead the way, prompting Philip to cheer and ask for more credit. As they walked, they heard the sounds of knights beating someone and shouting at their victim to stay in their place. The knights warned the child, whom they were repeatedly kicking, that he would listen only after he died. Philip was furious to see the knights abusing a young child. He clenched his teeth in anger, thinking about how some things had decayed and rotted even more over the 500 years that had passed. Just as he was about to shout at the knights to stop, a voice interrupted him. A woman commanded the knights to stop immediately. They turned, angry, and demanded to know who she was. The woman stepped forward and asked if they weren't the royal guards, supposed to protect the subjects. She chastised them for wielding violence against a child, asking if only nobles were considered subjects. Simon stood in stunned silence, shocked to see that the woman looked exactly like Katerina. She continued, shouting that even children had the right to protection, leaving the knights frozen in disbelief. The knights told her that even if she was a princess, there was no point in resisting, as the count himself had issued the order. They asked if she understood how restless the people had become due to the influx of refugees. She responded by asking them if they truly believed that locking people up like cattle in an environment unfit for living was the right thing to do, which shocked them even more. She stepped forward and addressed the knights, declaring that these were innocent children who had lost their nation and families. If there was guilt to be assigned, she said, she should be the first to bear it. Raising her voice, she proclaimed that before she was the princess of the Volga kingdom, she was one of the refugees seeking exile. One of the knights, clearly frustrated, told her that her defiance would only cause trouble. He added that they weren't doing this because they wanted to, but because they were following the count's orders. Philip, observing the escalating situation, whispered to him that things were getting serious and asked if they should intervene. He, however, replied by asking Philip if he knew who the woman was. Philip confirmed that he did, explaining that she was Princess Reina of the Volga Kingdom. He said she was famous for her disregard of noble etiquette and for standing up for the common people. Philip admitted he didn't know much more, only that her kingdom had fallen into ruin, and he never expected to see her in such a place. Hearing Reina's name confused him further. No matter how he looked at her, she was unmistakably Katerina. He wondered if Katerina had reincarnated as he had, and how she could look exactly the same after all this time. The knights grabbed hold of Reina, apologizing but insisting they couldn't allow her to continue. They explained that if they let her defiance go unchecked, they would be the ones punished. One knight began pulling her away while another restrained the child. Reina shouted at them, demanding to know what they were doing. The knights yelled back for her to stop interfering. Her cries of pain pierced the air, and he snapped, launching his fist at the knight and shouting for him to get his filthy hands off her. He punched the knight repeatedly, consumed by rage, thinking that even after all this time, no matter how the world changed, filth like this would never disappear. Reina grabbed his arm, pleading with him to stop and telling him there was no need to go so far. He halted, realizing what he was doing. Another knight appeared, sword drawn, calling him a fool. The knight demanded to know how he dared attack a guard, accusing him of defying imperial law. Philip stepped in, pointing his blade at the knight's neck and asking if imperial law mattered more to him than a life. The knight cursed Philip, calling him a bastard, and retreated with his comrades, shouting that they would make them regret it. Philip turned to him and urged that this wasn't the time to head to the gigant arena, suggesting they leave before things escalated further. But he ignored Philip's plea, rushing to Reina and calling her Katarina. He knelt beside her, asking worriedly if she was hurt and apologizing for losing control. Reina, trembling in fear, apologized to him instead. With wide, confused eyes, she asked him who he was. Her words left him stunned, frozen in disbelief. He stammered, asking her what she meant by who he was. However, she fearfully shouted at him not to come any closer. He tried to explain that he might look different and that she might not recognize him, but he could tell her everything. She interrupted him, saying it wouldn't be necessary, and asked what difference there was between him and the guards who had been abusing the children. He attempted to respond, but she cut him off again, telling him that he seemed to be mistaking her for someone else. She insisted that her name was not Katarina but Reina. Philip quickly rushed over, trying to de-escalate the situation. He apologized to Reina, explaining that it seemed Simon had made a mistake. He assured her that they were not suspicious people and began to clarify their situation. Meanwhile, Simon looked down at his hand, feeling a pang of sadness. He remembered enduring countless hours of solitude, holding on to the knowledge that she would never come back. He now felt as if he had fallen apart simply because this woman resembled her. Suddenly, someone called out to Reina. A man approached her butler, Victor, and asked what she was doing. Victor sternly reminded her that she had something important scheduled for the day and asked if she realized how difficult it had been to find her. Reina started to respond, but Victor interrupted, angrily asking if she had been fighting with the guards again. He then turned his attention to Simon and Philip, asking who they were. Victor introduced himself, stating that this was their first meeting and apologizing for the tense atmosphere due to various circumstances. He asked them politely to refrain from getting too close to the princess. Simon scoffed, calling them all stupid. He turned to Reina and told her that, while it was true he had misunderstood and escalated the situation, the fact remained that he had helped her. He added that he hadn't done so expecting anything in return, but she could at least have said thank you. His words left her speechless. He turned to Philip, telling him it was time to leave, and walked away. Victor, seeing this, told Reina they should leave as well. She nodded, but as they left, she realized she hadn't thanked him. Later, they arrived at the gigant arena, where the host announced an intense match currently underway. Simon and Philip found seats with a clear view of the action. Simon observed the match, confidently predicting its outcome. As he expected, one of the gigants defeated its opponent. The host announced the winner, Adolf. The crowd erupted into cheers. Philip turned to Simon, excitedly noting that his prediction was correct. At this rate, they would be able to pay off all their debts and even strike it rich. Simon thought to himself that it was easy. He speculated that gigants, being based on Golem magic, revealed the flow of mana in a way he could easily interpret to determine the winner. The hosts then announced the next match, promising it would be a bloodbath, and the match would be Savage versus Sting. Philip told him that he thought he would be able to predict the next match too, and asked him how Sting, with 1 win and 5 losses, could possibly win against Savage, who had 28 wins and 2 losses. He told Philip that although it was possible to win, despite such a disadvantage in strength, it seemed that match would be trivial. The host then announced to look at the large axes because there hadn't been a single gigant able to take them down. He introduced the dual axe-wielding Savage and its rider Brian. The host then called Savage's opponent, who had miraculously taken a victory last time, which gained his attention. The host introduced the lucky gigant, Sting. Philip told him that it was quite a pity because Sting had managed to get a lucky win, but now he was facing Savage. While watching Sting with its rider Karen walk onto the stage, he smiled upon seeing it and ordered Philip to go all in on Sting. Philip was shocked and asked him what he was saying when Savage was guaranteed to win that match, but he just calmly replied that he wondered because he could see a different victor. As the battle starts, Savage takes a swing at Sting, but he blocks it. When the hosts see Sting manage to fight back, they stutteringly ask what is going on and announce that Sting is putting on an unexpected performance. The host then shatters everyone's expectations of a painful defeat because Sting and Karen are blocking every single one of Savage and Brian's attacks. Brian laughingly tells Karen that he thought she was just an amateur, but he sees she has some skills. However, it is still not enough to satisfy him. Savage then raises both his huge axes and cuts off Sting's arm, making Philip shout to Sting that she can't lose. However, he remains silent, noticing that Sting has the upper hand in terms of mana flow and wonders just what they are thinking because they aren't using their mana at all. Brian laughingly tells Karen to get up because Sting's legs are still attached, and if she can't fight anymore, all he can offer her is more destruction. Savage then raises both of his axes again, making Philip panic and roll around, shouting that they are going to lose all their money at this rate. Savage then swings down his axes at Sting, but Karen activates her mana. When Savage's attack hits, it causes the floor to shatter into pieces, but Brian is shocked when Sting disappears. Sting then appears from above, while Karen asks Brian if he is aware that bets in Gigant matches can be adjusted up until 30 seconds into the match. She tells him that just now, that time frame has passed, so she can't afford to pay for any more repairs than this. Karen then casts her magic power and releases a fire blast using Sting to attack Savage. The hosts, in shock, ask how this could be and announce that an unprecedented event is happening today. Both hosts then announce that their champion, who bested the odds of 20-1 with pure skill, is Sting. Sting raises his one hand in victory. Philip shouts in happiness that they won and insists that he believed in him the whole time, though he is in shock and can't believe they used magic. He thinks it couldn't be possible, leaving Philip confused. Philip then explains to him that Sting's rider Karen must have been a rune knight. While it is uncommon to see Gigants using magic, they must have been hiding their strength to raise the odds. However, he knows that isn't the most important thing, because the fundamental theory behind using magic through weaponry is something he developed. He states that this method, no matter how much time passes, cannot be replicated by others, because it is a process he completed with the use of black magic. Later, in the Gigant Arena hangar, Philip asks him why he wanted to come to the hangar, but he remains silent. Philip asks again if they should head back as soon as possible, making him angrily shout at Philip to shut up because he is busy thinking, and Philip isn't helping. Suddenly they hear Victor's voice shouting at someone that she could still change her mind and asking how she got into a match with a Gigant like that. Victor also tells Reina that it wasn't a fight she should have accepted in the first place. However, she responds that a mercenary like Andre would have no trouble riding Meyer to fight the Count's Gigant. Philip tells him that they ran into Princess Reina again, and that she seems to be having some problems. Victor then asks Reina why she agreed to such a rash duel and reminds her that she'd need to marry the Count if she lost, which isn't a decision she can take lightly. Yet, she firmly tells Victor that she made her choice carefully and, if she didn't accept, countless refugees would have starved to death. To save everyone, it was the only way. Victor shouted to her that it couldn't be and asked how sacrificing her future could be a viable option. Victor added that with a Gigant that was falling apart, it was obvious she would lose. He accused her of wanting to protect the refugees so much that she didn't think about her own life, and asked why she didn't seek to protect herself at all. He told Philip that they should leave, as he was finished, and they should head back, to which Philip replied, "Okay." He then walked back toward the exit of the hangar, telling himself that Reina was not Katarina, and he didn't need to get involved. However, he overheard Victor telling Reina that she was just selling herself off, and that the Count was a man who stopped at nothing to get what he wanted. The mechanic then reminded Reina that the Count had threatened the refugees many times before, and that without her, the refugees would truly be helpless. The mechanic added that if she wasn't completely changing the mana stone, the Gigant wouldn't even be operable, but even if it was, the difference in specs compared to Count Monarch's Gigant would be too large to put up a proper fight, so she should listen to her butler. She replied that she was well aware of this, but she couldn't give up because if she lost without even trying, she wondered who else would stand up for the weak and cry in pain. At that moment, he approached them and asked if he could take a look. Reina looked back in surprise, but he simply told them that he thought the mana stone and the Gigant could still be used. Victor immediately stepped in front of Reina protectively and shouted for her to stand back. Victor then accused him, saying it was too convenient to be a coincidence, and suggested they could be assassins sent by Count Monarch. He angrily told Victor that he had been getting on his nerves, but Philip laughed and told Victor to put away the sword. He introduced him as Luke D. Lacan, the 15th descendant of the Lacan family and the current lord. However, Victor asked how they could trust his words. Reina then ordered Victor to stand down and walked closer to them, which made Victor visibly worried. She apologized for their previous meeting and admitted she was embarrassed to admit it, but they had no other way. She added that if it was all right, she'd like to ask another favor of him and begged him for help, to which he simply agreed. He then took out a dagger and told her it was to ensure he wouldn't make a mistake this time. He walked toward the open Gigant and told them he would make sure to show off his skills. The mechanic sighed and called out to Reina, telling her that Gigant repairs couldn't be done by just anyone. One of the other mechanics added that there was a reason Gigant specialists were called Iron Mages. They then asked if Simon might damage the Gigant further, and muttered that nobles with their massive egos always thought they knew everything. Philip grabbed the two mechanics and asked if they wanted to place a bet with him. Philip then angrily wagered 10,000 pesos that his seamen could easily fix the Gigant that they had failed to repair. One of the mechanics angrily asked why they would take an offer like that, but Philip teasingly replied that they didn't need to take it if they were scared. The mechanic, angered, asked what he meant by that and shouted for him to double the stakes because he was in. Reina then asked Philip if she could ask him a question, to which Philip immediately replied, yes. She then pointed at Simon and asked if a tool like a dagger was typically used to fix Gigants. Philip was equally confused, but then Simon slashed his palm with the dagger, stunning Philip in shock. Philip worriedly called out to him, but Simon sighed and shouted for Philip to shut up and just keep watching. Philip asked what he was planning. Simon then placed his bleeding hand on the machine and began to draw a magic circle on it with his blood. After completing the magic circle, he cast a spell, causing the mana stone to glow. When he saw it, he immediately ordered it to rise. The gigant released a powerful surge of energy in response. 500 years ago, in front of the magic tower, Simon was walking around and saw the destroyed golems scattered around him. He stopped in front of the remaining golem and asked if they had truly fallen to such a state. He then released his dark magic, declaring that they were immortal beings, those who lead their enemies to hell, and ordered them to answer his summons once more. The destroyed golems lying on the ground stood up in response and began to restore themselves, thanks to his dark magic. As before, he managed to awaken the destroyed gigant and make it functional again. Philip proudly shouted that it was as he expected, and that he had always believed in him. Meanwhile, the two mechanics were on the floor in disbelief. Reyna was in shock, witnessing that he had truly done it, and Victor wondered how Meyer was moving once again. Reyna couldn't believe Luke was able to revive a dead magic crystal, as she had never heard of such magic in her life. She realized that the entire continent or even the world would be amazed at such a historic event. Philip happily told him that there was nothing he couldn't do and said he'd believe him even if he claimed he could make a golem out of rocks. One of the mechanics shouted that it was impossible and accused him of using some kind of trick. They also questioned if drawing a magic circle with blood and activating it didn't clearly sound like black magic. Philip, visibly angered, asked them if they dared to accuse the sole heir of the Lacan family of using black magic. However, the mechanic retorted that, no matter how they looked at it, it was black magic. Luke intervened, explaining that the truth was, it was a top-secret technique passed down by the Lacan family, kept hidden for nearly 500 years. The mechanic still found his explanation hard to believe, and asked what kind of swordsman family would have a secret magic technique. At that moment, Reyna interjected, saying that it didn't matter. Even if it was black magic, Luke had saved countless lives. She thanked him sincerely and apologized for her misunderstanding during their earlier meeting. Luke replied that it was fine, and that her misunderstanding was no surprise. He was then caught off guard when she held his hand and wiped away the blood. Reyna told him that he was hurt because of her and insisted that he allow her to treat him, at least as a small repayment. He calmly responded that if it would put her at ease, she should be his guest. Suddenly, someone rushed to them in a panic, shouting that there was a huge problem. Victor demanded to know what had happened to make him scream his head off. The man stuttered as he shouted that Andre was gone. He wasn't in the waiting room, and they had searched all over the lodging but couldn't find him. Reyna was horrified by the news. Meanwhile, at Count Monarch's estate, someone reported that they had succeeded in winning over Andre, leaving Princess Reyna without any rider she could use. However, the informant hesitantly added that it seemed they had somehow succeeded in repairing their gigant. The Count, surprised, asked if he hadn't been told that their gigant couldn't be activated. The man confirmed that this had indeed been the case but explained that it had recently been activated. The Count slapped the man, making him stumble back and apologize profusely. The Count coldly told him that he hated apologies the most because they signified mistakes. The man begged fearfully for another chance, swearing that he would ensure the Count's wishes were fulfilled. However, Count Monarch sneered and ordered the man to scram, shouting that he was fired. Angrily, Monarch muttered that he had lost his appetite and asked his servants if there were any other variables. One of his servants stammered a response, assuring him that there were none. Monarch declared that there couldn't be even a sliver of probability left unaccounted for until Princess Reyna was completely his. Soon, he vowed, everyone would know exactly what kind of man the Master of Monarch truly was. Later, in the arena, the host announced the fight between Princess Reyna's Myra and Achilles. They told the audience there was an overwhelming difference between the two. The host then called out Count Monarch's opus magnum, Achilles, and proclaimed it to be the champion of the Lamer fiefdom, boasting 78 victories, and not a single loss. They urged the audience to see what Myra had prepared against the ever-victorious champion. However, Myra was nowhere to be seen in the arena, prompting the host to ask if they had abandoned the match. The audience began shouting, accusing Myra of running away in fear and demanding their money back. Monarch, observing the crowd's reaction, laughed and wondered if Reyna's side had given up, because they didn't have a rider. He sneered at Reyna, telling her that this was why she should have quietly accepted his marriage proposal. Now, he would show her the consequences of bruising his pride. Meanwhile, in the hangar, Reyna asked her servant if he truly meant that Andre was gone. The servant confirmed that Andre was nowhere to be found and suggested that Monarch had tricked them. Victor shouted at the servant, insisting that Andre was a loyal vassal, and demanded to know if he was implying that Andre had betrayed them. The servant stammered and explained that witnesses had seen Andre entering the Count's camp. Victor cursed, realizing that even without stealing Andre away, Monarch already had a significant strength advantage between their gigants. He couldn't believe Monarch had stooped so low, crushing them with underhanded tactics instead of pure power. Reina stood speechless, trembling in fear. He turned to Reina and asked if it was true that she would be forced to marry Monarch if she couldn't participate. He assured her that if she allowed it, he could help her resolve the situation. Reina stammered as she asked how he intended to do that. Philip interjected, trying to express that while he didn't doubt him, he hadn't forgotten the accident that occurred the last time he attempted to operate a gigant. He calmly told Philip not to worry, saying that operating a gigant was just a piece of cake. Minutes later, the audience and the host were stunned when Meyer entered the arena. The host excitedly announced that Meyer had not given up after all and had arrived just in time to face the ever-victorious Achilles. The crowd roared with excitement. Monarch, shaking with anger, demanded to know why Meyer was on the stage. He questioned his servant, asking if he hadn't assured him that there were no riders left on Reina's side. The servant stammered, insisting that he had been certain. Monarch began to suspect that Reina had hired a mercenary and couldn't believe it. He fumed, convinced that whoever was riding Meyer didn't understand the significance of this match. He couldn't fathom how anyone would dare to side with the princess in his territory. Reina and Victor arrived at the stage, and she anxiously asked Victor about the situation. Victor reassured her that they weren't late, and that, fortunately, they had made it in time. She expressed relief but hesitated, voicing her concern that it might not be all right. She pointed out that, at a glance, the difference between the gigant's performance was stark, and the opposing rider was Lamer Fiefdom's champion. Luke appeared behind her and assured her that it would be fine. He explained that, although he usually seemed simple-minded, the man on their side was highly skilled. Meanwhile, Philip sat inside Meyer, silently questioning why his young master Luke was putting him in such a position. The audience was shocked to see the destroyed gigant and wondered if they truly intended to fight. One of the spectators laughed and shouted that they couldn't believe it, saying that Meyer should have just run. Another audience member teased, asking if they were seriously calling a piece of junk like that a gigant and whether it could even move. Achilles addressed Meyer, applauding the fact that it hadn't run away, but warned that Meyer must understand the stakes of the match. Achilles declared that he had no intention of going easy on him. Philip, piloting Meyer, replied that Achilles would never know its true strength until he saw it in action. Achilles strikes a destructive blow in Meyer's direction, shouting that they should put Philip's confidence to the test. Philip managed to dodge the attack, noting that Achilles' power truly matched his massive size. Seizing an opportunity, Philip jumped behind Achilles and taunted him, saying that being big and strong didn't necessarily make him a good fighter. Achilles immediately turned and swings his mace at Meyer, shocking Philip with its speed. He barely managed to duck in time, avoiding the attack by a hair's breadth. Achilles remarked that Philip had dodged the attack, but declared that his confidence was clearly baseless. Meanwhile, Philip realized the situation was dangerous, recognizing that Achilles' rider was at least an expert knight. A moment later, the host announced that Achilles was unleashing a flurry of blows against Meyer, yet Meyer continued to dodge every single attack. Achilles, frustrated, launched another assault, but Meyer evaded again. The hosts commented on the unexpected turn of events, remarking that what they thought would be a quick match was turning into a prolonged battle, with Meyer not allowing a single hit to land. Victor cursed in frustration, shouting that they couldn't win by running forever. Reina whispered to Victor, telling him not to be so nervous because Simon had said Philip was a strong knight, and they should believe in him. Simon overheard Reina's whisper and acknowledged that Philip had faced countless knights before, leaving no doubt about his skills. However, Simon thought Philip might need some education later, wondering why he was playing the role of a rat instead of fighting properly. On the other hand, Philip cursed loudly, questioning whether Achilles ever got tired. He stopped running and steadied his sword, muttering to himself about trying a sneak attack. He swung at Achilles, landing a hit that made Achilles pause. Philip wondered if it had worked, but Achilles, angered, asked if he was finally ready to fight seriously. Stammering, Philip replied, not exactly. Achilles raised his weapon and shouted that he would now give it his all. The hosts, witnessing this, announced that Achilles was preparing his finishing move and questioned whether Meyer would be able to dodge even that. Philip stared at Achilles' weapon hurtling toward him, realizing he was in real danger. A loud explosion suddenly erupted on the stage. Achilles waited for the smoke to clear and was stunned to see that Philip had dodged the attack. Philip appeared behind Achilles, prompting Achilles to remark that Philip couldn't have gotten far enough to evade the strike. Philip quipped that his uncle Roger would kill him if he found out, but he had no choice. He needed to win because Simon had placed his hopes on him. Philip warned Achilles that he would regret forcing him to unleash his full power for the rest of his life. Achilles was impressed, amazed by the strong aura radiating from Philip, despite his young age. He admitted that he had sensed something from Philip's movements earlier, but now realized he had finally met a worthy opponent. Suddenly, Monarch's face appeared inside Achilles' cockpit, angrily asking him what the hell he was doing and whether he was crazy for struggling against a heap of junk like Meyer. Monarch reminded Achilles of the consequences of losing. Achilles apologized to Monarch for disappointing him and shouted that from now on, he would deliver a satisfactory performance. Achilles repositioned himself and dashed toward Meyer, shouting that they should save the fair duel for another day. Philip, piloting Meyer, calmly apologized, saying he was too busy to accept another fight after this one. Achilles strikes a powerful attack, causing the ground to shatter, but he was shocked when Meyer suddenly disappeared from view. In an instant, Meyer cut off Achilles' arm with a single swing, causing the massive gigant to collapse. Achilles, dazed, noticed the aura and speed of Meyer's rider, and suddenly remembered the rider who had disappeared 3 years ago, the undefeated legend of the gigant arena, the Black Knight's phantom sword. Meyer finished Achilles with another swift slash. The host shouted in amazement, declaring that something unprecedented had occurred. Achilles had been made inoperable in a flash, and the winner of the match was Meyer, the unexpected underdog. The audience erupted into thunderous cheers, celebrating Meyer's stunning victory. Achilles' rider, laughing, addressed Philip, expressing disbelief that he had the chance to meet the Black Knight again. Philip, surprised, asked the man if he knew him. The rider explained that he had faced the Black Knight in the Royal Arena 3 years ago, but had been left in awe after the legend vanished following his record-setting victories. He then asked Philip why he was in a place like this. Philip humbly replied that he was the Black Knight, but it was only natural for him to help people in need. The rider agreed and reassured Philip. He also promised to keep the fact that he was the Black Knight a secret. Philip thanked him and apologized for the trouble, while the rider, growing weary, said it was fine and waved it off. Meanwhile, Victor was in tears, telling Reina that they had won. Reina, puzzled, asked Victor why he was crying during such a joyous moment. Simon watched the happy Reina and concluded that everything seemed fine now. Quietly, he walked away from the stage, thinking he could finally leave that place with a lighter heart. As he walked, he stopped and glanced at the betting board, reflecting that gambling was all about the flow. He noticed that Meyer's odds had been set at 21-1 and thought to himself how easy it was to make money in this world. He then reviewed the financial outcome of the match for the lamer fiefdom. They had sold a statue for 3,000 pesos, doubling it to 6,000 pesos through gambling. Then, they earned another 4,000 pesos, making their total earnings 10,000 pesos. With the 21-1 payout from Meyer's victory, their total winnings amounted to an astounding 210,000 pesos.
Guys, that's the end of the video. If you liked this video, please leave a comment in the comment section. Also subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Like the video and share it too. Thank you for watching and see you next time again.